React Server Components RSCs have been around for a while now. Some developers are already using it in their Next.js project and enjoying the several benefits of it, and some other developers haven't started using it yet. Now, RSCs is something that took me a while to understand, and you're probably one of those developers who is confused by the concept of RSCs. You're probably wondering, what exactly is it? How is it different from client components? How is it different from server-side rendering? What exactly are the benefits of using server components over a client component? What are the limitations? What are the concerns I need to keep in mind when using this component? And that's the purpose of this video. I'll be simplifying this concept with diagrams and code examples. And at the end of this video, you would get to understand this concept better, but then you might also get to understand what the benefits might be for your own use case. React Server Components is a concept where React components are rendered exclusively on the server. And the keyword here is exclusively. Keep that in mind because this would greatly help you construct a mental picture of what RSCs are. RSCs are a new mental model, different from the way you might approach regular React applications, and they can take some time to get used to. But in this video, like I said, I'll be breaking this down, and we're going to be starting from a story where we see regular React applications, server-side rendering, and how server components fit in that picture. Now, in your normal React application, you have client-side rendering. For the longest of time, this is what we know React to be: framework or library that allows client-side rendering of your application. So in this case, you have your application hosted on localhost or whatever it is, and you have your browser, the client. This browser sends a request for a page. Now, what this server would do is it would respond with some resources necessary to render homepage. So it's going to respond with index.html. It's going to respond with some JavaScript files, going to respond with some CSS file, and many other resources that you use in your application. Now, when this index.html gets to the browser, it will most likely come to the browser as a blank page, and then the JavaScript is going to be run on the browser, and then that JavaScript would render the application, your headings, your paragraphs, all of those things. So in this case, the browser is necessary for rendering your application. And I have a simple React application here to show you that. I created this application with Vite, and this is the code that comes with it. And this would also look like your React application if you use Create React App or some other setup. Now, if we go to index.html, here we have a div with an ID of root, and then we have this script here, which is going to be replaced. And let's just say I have a heading here called CSR, which is going to show here. Now I'm going to run the production version of this website with npm run build. So now I can run the dist directory, which is the directory created with the production assets. I can run that with serve on localhost, and this is going to run on localhost 3000. So we have localhost 3000 running on the browser here. Now, if we go to the network tab, what you see is that on localhost, the server sends this index.html, which is pretty much what we have here. By the way, don't worry about these zero references. I can't seem to get it out of my VS Code. Here we have h1 CSR here, div ID of root here. And then for the script, this script is at the top here, which points to access/index something.js, which is basically what we have here. So this JavaScript file is basically what is responsible for rendering our application on the client. And to show you that that is the case, if in this DevTools I disable JavaScript, when I refresh this page, what you see is that all we have here is CSR, which is this, which means the JavaScript that was responsible for rendering the application on the client, that JavaScript is not run on the client, so we're not going to have anything. This is just to emphasize what I said, that with client-side rendering, the server sends the resources, and then the browser runs that JavaScript to render your application. Now, what about server-side rendering? Well, let's get to it. I also have a Next.js application here using the pages directory. This is what Next.js used to have before the app directory where we have server components. So in the case of server-side rendering, the client sends a request for the home page. Now in this case, the server is not going to hand over the responsibility of rendering to the client, but the server would actually render the page before it sends it to the client. But here is the thing. After rendering the component on the server, the browser is now going to send that page, maybe it is index.html. It's going to send some JavaScript resources and as well some CSS resources, and again, many other resources. But the rendering doesn't just stop at the server. the client is going to do something called hydration. So hydrating the components. I have a video with more details on the difference between CSR and SSR. I'll link it below. You should check it out. But I'm just going to summarize it here in this video. The browser is going to do something called hydration, and the idea of hydration is that it's going to add your event handlers to your components, run your effect, and do all of those client-side related things. So when it is rendered on the server, the components do not yet have those client-side things, but when it gets to the client, it is hydrated. Now, if I go back again to the network tab, you see again that on the network, we get local hosts. But then when I open local host, you see that I already get a rendered version of my component. Instead of normal client-side rendering where we just had div with an ID of root and then the client had to render it, from the server, you see that I already get the whole page here. Then that JavaScript for hydration is going to run, which is then going to execute this use effect. So this use effect is not executed from the server, it is executed on the client. So now if I come to console, I see client side stuff here. If I disable JavaScript and I refresh this page again, if I go to the network tab, we still get our local host because again, this is rendered from the server. But then when you turn off JavaScript, what you are disabling is that hydration. So if you have things like use state, event handlers, all of those client-side related things, they are not going to work because you turned off JavaScript. When I come to the console now, you can see I don't have client-side stuff here. But then coming back to our diagram, what you see with SSR, at least in the case of Next.js, is that when you render the component on the server, it doesn't stop there. The code for rendering the component would still need to be sent to the client, the browser in this case, because that code is required for hydrating the component. So this is one thing with server-side rendering, which we're going to talk more about later on, is that your component is rendered on the server, fine, but the code for your component will still be bundled and sent to the client because of hydration. Now let's talk about server-side code. Depending on the framework you are using, here we're using Next.js. And by the way, if you're wondering why we're using Next.js, well, this is because this is one of the frameworks that is heavily using server components right now. When you're using Next.js, you also have the ability to run some server-side logic, which is going to be code that is exclusively run on the server. So in this case, for example, I can have this server-side logic. I have get server-side props. And here I'm going to basically get props from the server and send it to that component, and then that component will be sent on the client. You can do server-side stuff here, read database, well, things you can do on the server. But then I have this API that I created here, hello.ts. Basically what this API is returning is this users. And if I go to users, well, this is just an array of user objects. Now, when you come here, I can receive this users prop, and then I can have my rendering list with that users array. npm run dev. Now here we have our server-side logic, and this server-side logic doesn't get to the client. So like I said, you can use your secrets, those variables, they won't be exposed on the client. And to verify that, I can come here to say console log running on the server. And now if I should refresh, you see we have running on the server here. But then if I should check the code that gets to the client, you see all we have on the client is client-side stuff, and client-side stuff again is coming from this use effect that we have here. But it doesn't change the fact that again, your component is going to be rendered on the server, and the code for your component will be sent to the client for hydration. Even if you're able to run some server-side logic, it doesn't change this fact. But not just that, with things like get server-side props, you can only run it on top level components. For example, here we have pages and index.csx, but you cannot run get server-side props on a normal component. But what if you could? What if you could run some server logic in just any component, and that component is rendered exclusively on the server, so that way whatever secret or whatever confidential logic you are doing stays on your server and doesn't get to your client? Well, that is where server component comes into the mix. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Okay, let's look at React Server Components RSC. Now with this, we're not going to have hydration anymore. Our component will be exclusively rendered on the server. So when the client sends /homepage, This component would be rendered on the server, and the rendered version is going to be sent to the client. And because they do not need hydration, the code for your component is not going to be bundled to the client. Now I'm going to explain why RSCs do not need hydration, but I just want you to keep this in mind. Now, if the server is not sending the code for that component, what that means is that you're going to have lesser bundle size, because the JavaScript that will be bundled to be sent for the client is not going to include the JavaScript for the server component. Lesser bundle size is one of the benefits of React Server Components. Again, I'm going to be using Next.js to show you server components. So here I have Next.js app page.tsx. Here I have my server component on the right, and here I have my normal SSR with some server-side logic here. Now with server components, since they can be run exclusively on the server, that means you can have your server logic directly in your components. So instead of having your data fetching logic, for example, here in get server side props, you can take the logic directly into your component. So here I have my home component, and what you notice is that this component has async, and that is something you cannot do in a normal React component, because a normal React component has to return a React node and not a promised React node. And now we can do our server-side logic, read database, read file, whatever it is you want to do, and we can just render that directly here. But then how do you know this is a server component? Well, in Next.js from version 13, every component is by default a server component, which means you have to explicitly tell Next.js what is a client component, but we'll come to that again in a second. Okay, now I can close this version. So I have my Next.js app. I'm going to navigate there, and then I can run npm run dev. And here we now have our components rendered from the server exclusively and sent to the client. And to verify that, I'm going to come here and just do console log, where am I rendered? And now if I should refresh this page, you can see where am I rendered is coming from the server. But if I should check the client and go to the console, see if I refresh, it's not here. It is only rendered on the server. In the case of server-side rendering, again, coming back to Next.js/pages, if I should put console log where am I running, you can see that on the client, we have where am I running, and as well on the server, we have where am I running. This is what I said with SSR, that on the server, you get a render, but because that code is also bundled to the client for hydration, you see here again, we still have where am I running. So I hope you're beginning to see the idea of server components. They run exclusively on your server, but then I mentioned earlier that RSCs do not need hydration, which is why they can be rendered exclusively on the server and not be included in the bundle for the client. And that is because if they needed hydration, they wouldn't be server components in the first place. Just to take you back to SSR, even though this was rendered on the server, we still needed the code for the components bundled to the client for hydration. Well, in the case of RSC, this is rendered exclusively because there won't be any hydration. And then this brings you to the limitations, or like I said, the new mental model that comes with working with server components. So here now, if I should try to do a client-side stuff, which would require hydration, we're going to get an error. So here, if I say use effect, and use effect is a client-side thing, now we have an error. The error says that you are importing a component that needs use effect, and that only works in a client component. When you do something like this, now hydration is required, which means this cannot be a server component anymore. And if this cannot be a server component anymore, you need to tell Next.js, I want this to be a client component. And this is where use client comes in. You've probably seen this around, wondering what it is. Well, this tells Next.js that I want this to be a client component. And now I have a warning. The warning says prevent client components from being async functions. Okay. So if I'm not making this an async function, that means I cannot have this direct server logic anymore. But let me take this back to my server component, and I'm going to take this use effect off. React Server components cannot be re-rendered. They come once from the server, and React expects them to never change. And in the case of a change, then you have to refresh the page to reach the server again. Now, since these components cannot be re-rendered, this component cannot manage states. In fact, the dynamic client-side things that you do with your normal component, You cannot do them with Server Components. You can think of Server Components as static generated HTML that comes from the server. That means if you want to use effect in your components, then that is where you need to introduce a client component. So here I have this client component. It's a simple one. Now if I try to render that component here, I'm going to get an error. You're importing a component that needs use effect. It only works in the client component. I know that, so I can come here to say use client, and now this works fine. If we open the console, now we have I run on the client coming from the client component here. So in this case, what's happening now is we have our server component, which is home. We have our server-side logic here, and then we can import a client component into that server component. But coming back to our diagram here, our component now has a mix of server component and client component. And what's going to happen is that the server is going to render the server component and the client component, but then only the code for the client component will be bundled to the client because the client component needs hydration. If I come here to the network tab, you see that on the network tab, we have the rendered HTML here already of all our users, and then we have this P client component. But then only the JavaScript necessary to hydrate the client component will be sent from the server. And that is why in my diagram here, I said lesser bundle size, because the server components are not going to be bundled. But then the RCCs, the React client components, since they need hydration, they would be included in the bundle. Again, new mental model. When you're using server components, there are certain things you cannot do, which you can do in normal client components. So you're probably thinking, if I cannot do those things in server components, then why exactly do I need them? Well, I've already shown you the first benefit, right? Less bundle size. And if your application is small, less bundle size might not really mean anything. But as your application grows, the potential size of your JavaScript bundle also grows, which means it's going to be bigger to download, bigger to pass on the client. And if you think about it, when building an application, not everything needs to be interactive. Not everything needs to require JavaScript on the client. Take, for example, Unsplash. All of these headings can be server components. You don't need JavaScript on the client for this. Now, in the case of this search, you probably need client components for this, because as you type, you have a list of options here. Now, this whole page, some of it can also be server components. All of these images can come directly from the server. But in this case, where you click on something and then you have this modal, well, this can be a client component. Again, like I said, new mental model. When you're able to separate this server related stuff from the client related stuff, it can improve the performance of your application in different ways. But also the Next.js docs shows more benefits of server components. Now, some of these benefits you could argue depending on your company, the project you're working on, the set of rules or standards that you follow in your company. But here, data fetching, server components allow you to move data fetching to the server closer to your data source. Like I said, in your component, you can make a direct database call because it's on the server and it's not going to be sent to the client. And this can improve performance by reducing time it takes to fetch data needed for rendering and the number of requests the client needs to make. There's also security because you keep sensitive data and logic on the server. There's also caching. By rendering on the server, the result can be cached and reused on subsequent requests and across users. And then there's the performance side of things, and it says here that, for example, if you start with an app composed of entirely client components, moving non-interactive pieces of your UI to the server component can reduce the amount of client-side JavaScript needed. And this is beneficial for users with slower internet or less powerful devices because less work of rendering to do on the client, as the browser has less client-side JavaScript to download, pass, and execute. And then there are other benefits like initial page load and FCP, search engine optimization because your data is already available from the servers, and as well there is streaming. So now you have to think of separating your server-side logic from your client-side logic, and this can also be a good standard to follow where you have your components responsible for fetching data, and then you have your components responsible for doing the use states, the use effects, and all those things. So React Server Components is not a replacement for React Client components. Like we saw with Unsplash, this is actually a mix. You have your React Client components doing the interactive things, your server components doing the fetching, and you also have your SSR, which sort of binds everything together, because with SSR, your server components are rendered on the server, there is that, but then your client components would still be rendered on the server and hydrated on the client. Server component is not a replacement for server-side rendering, and server-side rendering is also not a replacement for server components. It's a whole mix of things. You can create an application with just SSR, with just RSC, with just RCC, or with all of them. Now, what are the things to keep in mind when using server components? I've actually touched on them a bit, but just to summarize, firstly, your server components are not like your regular client component. So things related to the client side would have to be moved to client components. In the case of Next.js, you need to have that use client directive. Another thing to note is that a server component can import a client component, but a client component cannot import a server component. If a client component imports a server component, that instance of the server component becomes a client component. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, let's just create a component here. I'll call this server.tsx. So yeah, I have server.tsx, which by default is a server component. Now I can import this server component in this page, server, and here we have I am a server component, and I could also import this client component in this server component. But now this client component, let me wrap this in a div. This client component, if I should import this server component here, now if I should refresh, you see we have client component, I am a server component. Well, actually that's a lie. This is no longer a server component because this instance is part of this client component where we use client. Now this is going to be a client component, which means I could even come to this server component here and I could use my use effect. If I use this here, of course, we're going to have an error. Here is where things can get tricky. You see here we put use client, which means we're explicitly telling Next.js is a client component. But here we're not telling Next.js is a client component, so it assumes by default that this is a server component. But if I come to this page here and I comment this server, what you're going to see is this now works fine. So what is happening here is that in this client component, because I have use client, then every instance of components that we have here is also going to be treated as a client component. And this is where you hear things like client boundaries when talking about server-side components, because you sort of create boundaries as to where something should be a server component and something should be a client component. Here, I don't have use clients, but because I use this instance here, this is now treated as a client component. So this is why I said client components cannot import server components, because once they do, that instance becomes a client component. But then if I should come here and import this here, now I'm going to have an error because I have some client-side logic here, which means in that case, I have to explicitly use client for Next.js to accept that this use effect can now run. I emphasized earlier on about this new mental model. You can see how all of these tricky, might I say, details can make things confusing, because at some point you think, oh, let me take this from here and take this from here. You might think like, oh, I only have one client component because this is the only component I used use client, and these components are going to be server components. Well, that is not true, because yes, this is a server component, but this instance of this server is a server component, which means the bundle for this component would not be sent to the client. But in this case, this is going to be a client component, and then the bundle for that component would also be sent to the client. It's not going to be rendered exclusively on the server anymore. Well, I hope this video and all these examples helps you to understand how client components are different from server components and how server components are also different from server-side rendering. I'll make another video where I go into more detail on the difference between server components and server-side rendering, but that video is really just going to be a summary of all that I have said here. With server-side rendering, your component gets rendered on the server, but it needs hydration on the client. With client-side rendering, your components are not rendered on the server. The responsibility is entirely the browser's job to render. With React Server Components, your components are rendered exclusively on the server and they are not included in the bundle for the client. They are just sent as static generated HTML to the client. If you have more questions about server components, let me know in the comments and I can make videos on them. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share it with others who may find it useful, and also subscribe for more React videos or Next.js videos like this.